Massachusetts has a reputation for history, seafood, and attitude. What that reputation skips over is a state where 4 entire towns were deliberately flooded and erased from the map to build a reservoir, where an entire neighborhood of Boston was stolen from the sea, where a rock on Plymouth Beach is made of African granite that arrived here when the continent split apart hundreds of millions of years ago, and where the most dramatic geographic features in the state are sitting thousands of feet underwater and almost nobody knows they exist. These are 22 facts that prove Massachusetts runs a lot deeper than its history books suggest. Subscribe to Wild States Facts before we start. Fact 1. In the 1930s, the state government flooded an entire valley in central Massachusetts to build the Quabbin Reservoir, the largest inland body of water in the state. 4 complete towns named Dana, Enfield, Greenwich, and Prescott were demolished. Thousands of people were forced to abandon homes their families had lived in for generations. The water rose over everything. Today, if you dive deep enough into those cold, dark waters, you can still find old roads and stone foundations on the bottom. 4 towns exist permanently underwater in the middle of Massachusetts. Fact 2. Mount Glacial, the highest point in Massachusetts at 3,491 feet, sits in geographic isolation, dramatic enough that on a clear day you can see 5 states from the summit simultaneously: Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, New York, and Connecticut. The elevation is modest by Western standards. The isolation is not. Fact 3. Near Shelburne Falls, the bedrock of a riverbed contains over 50 massive circular basins carved into solid metamorphic rock, some nearly 40 feet across. They were formed roughly 14,000 years ago as glaciers melted and released enormous torrents of water. Stones trapped in small cracks in the rock were spun by swirling currents, drilling downward into the bedrock over thousands of years like natural drill bits. The process ground smooth, perfectly circular holes into solid stone, some deep enough to swallow a car. Fact 4. Massachusetts has a deliberate notch in its southern border that breaks the straight line with Connecticut, known as the Southwick Jog. It exists because colonial-era surveyors working with limited tools and reportedly occasionally while intoxicated produced incompatible boundary surveys between 1642 and 1804. The resulting legal disputes over 2 square miles lasted for generations. The residents of Southwick fought to stay in Massachusetts and won. The border has been wrong in exactly the same way ever since. Fact 5. The Holyoke Range runs east to west, almost uniquely among mountain chains in North America, which almost universally run north to south. It was formed roughly 200 million years ago through volcanic activity during the Triassic and Jurassic periods, composed of extremely hard basalt lava that resisted erosion while the softer rock around it wore away. A 200-million-year-old volcanic spine oriented in the wrong direction, sitting in the middle of Massachusetts. Fact 6. The Connecticut River Valley contains one of the highest concentrations of dinosaur footprints in the entire world. During the early Jurassic period, the valley was a low-lying, swampy basin that collected layers of mud perfect for preserving tracks. You can see distinct 3-toed prints from creatures including Dilophosaurus pressed into sandstone approximately 200 million years old. Early scientists in the 1800s believed these were made by giant prehistoric birds. It took decades to establish they were the walking paths of apex predators. Fact 7. Boston Harbor's 34 islands are not typical islands. They are drumlins, elongated, teardrop-shaped hills made of glacial debris, including clay, sand, and boulders, that were pushed into streamlined shapes by ice sheets over a mile thick during the last ice age. As the glaciers melted and sea levels rose, water flooded the valleys between the hills and left only the tops exposed. Boston Harbor is the only place in the world where you can find a partially drowned drumlin field. Fact 8. Martha's Vineyard exists entirely because a glacier stopped moving exactly where it did. About 21,000 years ago, the Laurentide ice sheet reached its maximum southern extent and dumped millions of tons of rock and debris it had carried from the north, forming the rugged, hilly backbone of the island's western side. The multicolored cliffs at Aquina are ancient clay and fossils that were physically shoved upward from the seafloor by the advancing ice. Without that glacier stopping in exactly that location, the island would be flat continental shelf sitting underwater. Fact 9. Plymouth Rock, the most famous stone in American history, is made of granite that does not match the local New England bedrock. The specific type of granite matches rock found in parts of Africa. The explanation is that this piece of crust was part of the same landmass as Africa before the continent split apart hundreds of millions of years ago. When Pangaea broke apart, this fragment stayed behind in what became North America. The Pilgrims stepped onto African rock and never knew it. Fact 10. The Nantucket Shoals extend 40 miles into the Atlantic from the coast, a vast field of underwater sand hills where the water depth can suddenly drop to as little as 3 feet without warning. The currents move in circular patterns that constantly reposition the shoals, meaning their exact location changes continuously. They have sunk hundreds of ships throughout history and are so dangerous that the International Maritime Organization has officially designated the area as a zone to be avoided by large vessels. Fact 11. The tip of Cape Cod near Provincetown is not where the glacier left it. The hook shape at the northern end was created by 6,000 years of ocean currents eroding the outer edges of the cape and moving that sand northward through longshore drift. The land is still shifting, growing in some places, disappearing in others with every storm. Cape Cod is not a fixed landform. It is a living geographic feature being actively reshaped by the Atlantic right now. Fact 12. In the early 19th century, there was a functioning community on Billingsgate Island, just off the coast of Wellfleet. Over 30 houses, a schoolhouse, and a lighthouse. The island was a sandbar left by the glaciers, and the Atlantic was already working on it. By the early 1900s, the ocean had erased the entire island. Today, it reappears only during the lowest tides of the year as a patch of mudflats and scattered bricks. An entire community swallowed by the sea within a single century. Fact 13. The Connecticut River follows an ancient geological fault line through the heart of Massachusetts, a massive sunken trench formed roughly 200 million years ago when the Earth's crust began pulling apart. The riverbed tilts slightly east, causing the water to erode the eastern banks far more aggressively than the western ones. The rich agricultural floodplain contains sediment from a massive prehistoric lake that covered the entire valley floor for thousands of years after the glaciers melted. Fact 14. The white marble quarried in Lee, Massachusetts, formed over 500 million years ago when intense heat and pressure transformed ancient limestone into metamorphic marble, was used to build the columns of the United States Capitol and the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. The physical geography of a small Massachusetts town is literally integrated into the architecture of the nation's most symbolic structures. Fact 15. The Hoosac Tunnel is a 5-mile railroad passage cut directly through the solid metamorphic rock of the Hoosac Range in the northwestern corner of the state. Construction began in 1851 and took 24 years to complete, requiring the use of experimental nitroglycerin explosives. The rock, extremely hard gneiss and schist, resisted nearly every tool available at the time. Nearly 200 workers died during the project. It earned the name the Bloody Pit. It is still in use today. Fact 16. The Cape Cod Canal, completed in 1914, turned Cape Cod from a peninsula into an island by cutting a channel through the narrowest section of land. It is the widest sea-level canal in the world without locks. The tidal difference between Cape Cod Bay and Buzzards Bay drives currents through the canal at up to 6 miles per hour. A single engineering decision permanently changed the shape of Massachusetts. Fact 17. The Taunton River in southeastern Massachusetts is one of the few large rivers in the United States that remains almost entirely free from major dams. Its tidal reach extends nearly 18 miles inland, and because the river is so flat, Salt water from the ocean flows upstream during high tide, creating a brackish zone where freshwater and saltwater species coexist. The river's flow reverses direction twice a day, a river that routinely flows the wrong way. Fact 18. The Back Bay neighborhood of Boston, now some of the most expensive real estate in New England, was a tidal marsh and saltwater flat until the mid-1800s. For nearly 30 years, special trains ran 24 hours a day from the hills of Needham, carrying over 5 million cubic yards of gravel to fill in the bay and create new land. The massive stone buildings in Back Bay today are supported by thousands of wooden pilings that must remain permanently submerged in groundwater to avoid rotting and collapsing. Boston's most elegant neighborhood is built on engineered mud, held up by underwater wood. Fact 19. The Blackstone River drops 438 feet over its 48-mile course from Worcester to Rhode Island, more feet per mile than the Mississippi River drops in its lower sections. That extreme gradient made the Blackstone the engine of the American Industrial Revolution, powering dozens of mills along its banks. The first successful water-powered textile mill in the United States was built here in 1793. One river's geographic drop rate changed the course of American manufacturing. Fact 20. Stellwagen Bank sits 65 feet below the surface of Massachusetts Bay, a massive underwater plateau of glacial sand and gravel surrounded by water hundreds of feet deep. The sharp boundary between the shallow bank and the surrounding deep ocean forces deep, nutrient-rich currents upward to the surface in a process called upwelling. That upwelling is why thousands of whales, dolphins, and fish concentrate in this area every year. The most productive marine geography off the New England coast is an underwater pile of glacial debris. Fact 21. Extending off the coast of Massachusetts on the floor of the Atlantic Ocean is the New England Seamount Chain. More than 30 massive underwater volcanoes formed roughly 100 million years ago as the North American tectonic plate moved over a volcanic hotspot. Some of these underwater mountains exceed 13,000 feet in height, nearly 4 times taller than any mountain on the Massachusetts mainland. They are invisible from shore, unknown to most people, and among the most geographically dramatic features in the entire region. Fact 22, and the one that ties this whole list together. Massachusetts looks like one of the most thoroughly settled, historically documented, and geographically understood states in the country. Beneath that surface is a state where 4 towns are permanently underwater, where ancient African rock sits on the most famous beach in American history, where a glacier determined the shape of islands people have been visiting for centuries, and where the tallest mountains in the region are sitting on the ocean floor where nobody ever sees them. Massachusetts is not finished being shaped. The Cape is still moving. The harbor islands are still eroding. The seamounts have been growing for 100 million years. The geology here does not particularly care about the history books built on top of it. That is 22 facts that prove Massachusetts runs a lot deeper than the history that made it famous. If one of these changed how you see the state, tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if wild, real geography is your thing, subscribe to Wild States Facts, where I am covering every state, one wild fact at a time. See you in the next one.